Welcome, everyone. This is Gilgamesh, and we're about to dive into part two of this introduction to Isaiah. And so, what does this mean? Why is there so much stuff into the future beyond Isaiah's lifetime? And this brings us to the question of, is there one Isaiah, or are there three Isaiahs? And the majority opinion is that Isaiah is not a single author, that there are at least three of them, although many will argue for even more divisions than that. Chapters 1 through 39 are considered generally the oldest part of Isaiah, and they believe that this is the Isaiah that was active between 739 and about 680. And so he wrote better than half of the book, 1 to 39 there. Then, starting in chapter 40, a dramatic shift takes place in the text. And 40 and onward were considered to be the work of later authors. And this theory has been around for a couple of centuries now. This is chapters 40 through 55 are often known as Second Isaiah. It is believed from the writing that he had there that he lived after Jerusalem was destroyed. And somewhere in the neighborhood of the early 580s kind of thing, that's when Second Isaiah is believed to have lived, although I must say these dates are far from certain, and you'll see a lot of different people proposing different dates. Then the last 11 chapters of the book, chapters 56 through 66, we have those for Third Isaiah, and it is believed that he lived after the exile and in the Persian era, and so he lived somewhere around 530 BCE. And so these are the three Isaiahs. Now, I will tell you that I am not entirely convinced that there were three Isaiahs. It is somewhat indisputable that the text has been edited many times and that some parts of the book are additions by later peoples. There's also indisputably a huge shift in the style of writing starting in chapter 40. I don't know that multiple Isaiahs is, in my mind, the most convincing reason for that. But I will tell you, it is the majority opinion that these are shifts in authorship, and very few people still hold out for a single authorship in Isaiah. But I'm one of those people. And I don't have substantial evidence to back that is just simply my own person. But we'll be talking about it, though, and talking about the evidence for this, and occasionally some of the evidence for the unity of the book overall. And this is actually a criticism of a lot of the modern scholarship, is that often overlook the fundamental unity of the text, that even though there are these major shifts in theme and writing style, there is an overarching unity to the book as well. Some other things about why they believe that there is multiple Isaiahs. Of course, scholars do not generally accept the idea that prophets can see the future. And so therefore, if you are talking about Cyrus, you must be writing in the time of Cyrus or afterwards. And Cyrus is mentioned twice by name in Isaiah. If this is from the original Isaiah, it is a remarkable bit of foresight to prophesy by name of somebody who would not live for over a century after your own life. So there's not a whole lot of other places, even in the Bible, where that kind of prophecy occurs. It is very suspicious. It also speaks clearly about the rise of Babylon and Babylon's overthrowing of Jerusalem and the eventual fall of Babylon, all of which would happen well after Isaiah's lifetime. And so, is it reasonable that he saw these things and wrote about them in such detail, or is this the work of a later author writing in his name about the things happening in his time? And these are questions that you'll have to answer for yourself. But that is the reason why we believe there are multiple Isaiahs. The other thing that I want to bring out here is the shift between 55 and on 40 through 55 and then 56 through 60. That shift between Second Isaiah and Third Isaiah is not as noticeable and was not thought of as early as the idea of Second Isaiah. So the concept of a Third Isaiah is a younger theory than the idea of Second Isaiah. And it is still there. There is a shift, but it is not nearly as noticeable. Now, people have done computer analysis of the book of Isaiah overall, and interestingly, that work has shown that there is a great deal of unity in the actual style of language and some of the way that the grammar works throughout the book. So it's not totally without evidence that the book could be one organic whole. There's also thematic, literary, and doctrinal ideas that are unified throughout the book. So we're not going to see doctrines that are wildly different in the latter part of the book from the first part of the book. There is quite a bit of unity across. We will see different emphasis, but many of the doctrines discussed in the latter part of the book are also present in the earlier parts. One theory that I like is the idea that from chapter 40 through chapter 66 were intended as a written work. And one of the big differences and shift here is that the poetry gets longer, it is higher quality poetry, and it is more connected across the entire latter part of the work. The first 39 chapters are quite choppy. It is short fragments. There is a lot of poetry, but it does frequently go into prose. And also there is a brief historical interlude right at the end between the two sections. And so the thought is that most of the way this message would have been conveyed in its time would be orally. That was probably the mode in which prophets in Isaiah's time operated, is that they spoke orally to the people, and then their disciples probably captured and wrote down their sermons. And that may be what's happening in the early part of the book and why it is so fragmentary and short. It wasn't like they had shorthand back then. The tape recorders couldn't even slow things down. This was working under primitive circumstances to capture live speech. And so they would probably capture portions, and maybe imperfectly, of phrases that he said, maybe stock phrases that he would often go back to. These would get written down and then placed together thematically in the work by his students. And so that may be what's happening in the early chapters of the book. And then 40 through 66 may be his written work, where he intended it to be a written work and approached it very differently. I think this does account for a lot of the differences in the two sections. And if you'd like to believe in a single author, then this is a good workable model for how that might have been. But that is one of the things that we'll look at. It definitely does talk about in the book of Isaiah, about Isaiah writing down his prophecies and preserving them. And we're going to see that in the text itself. So how did we get Isaiah? Well, from a Christian perspective, Isaiah came to them largely from the Vulgate, which was a Latin translation. And from the Jewish perspective, it descended from the Masoretic text, which was a Hebrew text. Our more modern look at Isaiah, both Christians and Jews, go back to the Hebrew text. And that is something that changed during the Protestant Reformation. And one of the big factors in was the King James Version in 1611. And most people that really know Isaiah know it from the King James Version. In fact, you probably have heard it in Handel's Messiah, which is directly from the King James Version. You've heard it in a lot of recapped in a lot of poetry and different musical routines, all of which go back to the King James Version. Well, the King James Version came around in 1611. But the problem is, how did the King James Version allow them to go back to the original Hebrew? Well, the fact is that Christians no longer knew any Hebrew. It had become a completely unknown language to them. And for that matter, the Jews had not had the same level of education in Hebrew that they used to. It was becoming a dwindling thing among Jewish people. And since Jews and Christians did not get along well, there was no transfer of knowledge. And so the Christians had to rely completely on their Latin translations in order to read Isaiah. But then back in 1492, yes, the same year that Columbus was sailing the ocean blue, there was a Catholic humanist by the name of Johann Reuchlin, and he has become one of my favorite people. He was a very brave and daring man. He started reading Hebrew with a Jewish physician named Yaakov ben Yahil Lones. And he learned Hebrew and was the first Christian to do so in a very, very long time. And he was able to write the first Hebrew grammar for non-Jewish people. And this was published in 1506 in German. And so this opened up the way for Christians to again learn Hebrew. And this influenced the Tyndale translation and then to a great degree the King James Version of the translation, so they could again go back to the same text that the Jews had been using and bring that into the vernacular language of English and German and the other European languages so that people had direct access to a text that came directly from the Hebrew rather than it being translation of a somewhat poor translation into Latin. And so this made a huge step forward in the understanding of Isaiah outside of the Jewish community. King James translators, they were broken up into different committees to translate different parts of the Bible. There were 47 translators, scholars in the King James Version that would complete the work. About 7 of those scholars were assigned to the book of Isaiah, and the translation took place at Cambridge University. And so we have this group of 7 scholars that have been trained in Hebrew, and they tackle one of the greatest works of Hebrew literature ever and one of the most difficult, and translate the book of Isaiah. They did, in places particularly where the text is very hard, had to rely on the Greek and the Latin translations to help guide them as to what it should say. But overall, given the circumstances under which this was done, the newness of even knowing Hebrew, they did a remarkable job. And of course, they had a complete mastery of the English language, so many of their translations in and of themselves are just profoundly beautiful and have influenced our society culturally and linguistically. And so I have to give a bit of a shout out to these 7 scholars at Cambridge who translated Isaiah. They did a great job of it. Now, the source text that they use for this, how do they get a copy of the Hebrew Bible? This is also a fascinating thing. Oh, and let me say before we go on, if you want to learn more about Johann Reuchlin, I did 2 podcast episodes on his life, and you'll find those on my channel. I'll leave a link to them. And I strongly recommend it. He's just a fascinating person. He stood up against anti-Semitism. He brought Jewish literacy and Hebrew into the Renaissance, caused a growth and a rebirth in looking at the Hebrew Bible that would not have happened otherwise, and opened up opportunities for Jewish people that would not have been otherwise. And he also went to great lengths to defend the Jews against forced conversions, which was something that was a very serious threat back then. Both forced conversions and book burnings were rampant through his time, and he helped defend the Jews against this during the Inquisition. So, fascinating guy, hero to both Christian scholarship and also a hero in the realms of anti-Semitism. So, go check out those episodes if you'd like to learn more about Johann Reuchlin. But the text that they used for the Hebrew here was one of the first real printed from a printing press copies of the Hebrew Bible. It was known as the Second Rabbinic Bible. It was published by Daniel Bomberg in 1519. Now, you have to remember that to publish something in Hebrew, you need a whole bunch of movable type in Hebrew, and you have to have the text running the opposite direction of English. So there were a lot of barriers to making this happen. They had to invent a lot of new things about how to do printing to be able to print in Hebrew. And they did all. And they made this great text here from the best manuscripts that they had available to them at the time. And this became known as the Second Rabbinic Bible. There was a first, of course. It had a lot of errors in it. And so the second was the revised version, greatly improved over the first. Still had a number of issues to it. So Bomberg was an important publisher of Hebrew and Jewish texts. He was the first to use the printing press for Hebrew. And so Bomberg worked with Rabbi Yaakov ben Chaim to correct the Masoretic text for the second printing. And so this became known as the Ben Chaim text. And you'll hear sometimes about the Ben Asher text and the Ben Chaim text, occasionally the Ben Naphtali text. This is what we mean by the Ben Chaim text, is this first really quality printed Hebrew Bible from a printing press, is the Ben Chaim text, done by this Rabbi Yaakov ben Chaim, who helped correct it and get it accurate. It would become the standard for many centuries to come among both Jews and Christians, but there were still a number of issues with it because getting to the best text was very difficult in that day and age. What are the best texts? Okay, so the best texts are what are known as the Ben Asher texts, and there are 2 to know about. The first one is the Aleppo Codex. It was handwritten in 980 CE or AD. This is very recent. I mean, text of Isaiah was composed almost 2,000 years earlier in the mid 700 BCs. So we're talking about 980 BCE or AD here, quite a bit later, that our oldest handwritten copy of the Hebrew Bible. Now, unfortunately, there was a riot in 1947 in Aleppo that destroyed about 40% of the text, including almost the entire 5 books of Moses or Torah section. It was a great tragedy. It was our oldest copy of the Hebrew Bible, and it was carelessly destroyed by a mob. In an effort to protect it, the keepers of that text had refused to allow it to be photographed, and that unfortunately worked against us as well. That a great portion of it is lost, never to be retrieved. Only a few people were able to view it, and that was starting in 1937. So that is a tragedy in every way imaginable. Now, there is a great cloak and dagger story of this, of how it was smuggled out of the area and wound its way back into the modern state of Israel. What is left of the manuscript is now in the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem. And so it is being preserved, and it has been photographed since then. So the remaining portions of it are photographed, and you can get access to them online. So the oldest complete version of the Hebrew Bible that still remains was written a few decades later in 1008 CE. And so it's slightly younger than the Aleppo Codex, but it is now the best text that we have available if you want the entire thing. Now, you'll notice that I didn't say that the book of Isaiah was destroyed, so we actually do have the book of Isaiah from the Aleppo Codex. But if you're studying the entire Hebrew Bible, the Leningrad Codex is what you have to go to, and it is extremely similar to the Aleppo Codex. And I should say this, a codex is a book, basically. It is a set of parchments that are bound on one side like a book. So these are not scrolls. These resemble much more like a book. And they have the full vowel points and musical notations in them. This is actually where all of that traces back to. These are our oldest copies of such things. So all of our various vowel points and musical notations, if you know Hebrew at all, these are things that were added to the text after the biblical period. These are some of our oldest copies of those things and how we know of these things. Now, Ben Asher has to do with the family of editors that edited this in the Masoretic tradition, and this is considered the most authoritative copy that we have available. Scholars, again, 1935. That's where we really started looking at this. We only knew about it in 1838. So we really only discovered these ancient manuscripts in modern times, really. And so when we talk about the King James Version using the Ben Chaim text, and those were the best available to them, these texts weren't even understood to exist at that time. Obviously, they were somewhere. Someone was taking care of them, but they didn't even understand the significance of what they had. And so only in modern times have we understood the significance of these texts and really taken the steps to preserve them. Leningrad Codex, of course, is also fully photographed and available online. It is also the foundation for the critical edition of the Hebrew Bible that is used by scholars today, known as Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, or BHS. And so if you want a copy of the BHS, it's going to be based on the Leningrad Codex. So the other thing to understand about Isaiah is what happened in 1946. There was a Bedouin shepherd boy who threw a rock into a cave and heard something break, and it changed the world. Inside, he found a jar that had just broken, and inside that jar were ancient scrolls. And this was the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, we have found multiple caves that have had scrolls in them along the Dead Sea, and so this is not a single spot. But in that cave one was the great Isaiah scroll. And that's what you see a picture of here. It's rolled out, and you can see that it is complete. It's got a few frayed edges here and there, but it's largely complete. And it is the only scroll that is preserved this well. And so of all the scrolls that we found, the one that really was preserved entirely for us is the book of Isaiah. And so suddenly we go from the Aleppo Codex, 980 CE, to the Isaiah scroll of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was written around 150 BCE. That's over 1,000 years older. And one of the fascinating things about it is it's largely the same. It's extremely well preserved over that 1,000-year period, which answered a lot of questions that people weren't sure how much we could rely on these manuscripts and if they really represented what the Hebrew Bible looked like, or if they were much later inventions. And so suddenly our oldest copy of Isaiah gets pushed earlier 1,000 years. So I cannot express the importance of this find. It is one of the greatest finds of all of archaeology. And it is not the only thing that we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We've actually found copies of almost every book in the Bible among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Book of Esther is one of the few that isn't in it. But everything else we found, not only copies of the books, but usually multiple copies of the books. As far as Isaiah goes, there were 21 different Isaiah scrolls. None of them were preserved like the Great Isaiah Scroll. But we have 21 different scrolls that were part of that collection, portions of which have survived. The only thing that there's more of is the Psalms, where there are 36 copies of the Psalms. So this scroll is sometimes called 1Q Isaiah. A means it was the first Isaiah scroll found in a cave. 1 stands for cave 1, Q for Qumran. So 1Q Isaiah is how it's often referred to. And it's fascinating and brings us a whole new world of information about the book of Isaiah, much earlier than previously. Hello, everyone. That was the end of the second segment of this now 3-part introductory section. In the next segment, we will talk about the literary forms in Isaiah and a little bit about Hebrew poetry and how it works. If you're enjoying this, please like and subscribe, hit the bell icon, join us on Discord, all those things, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you.